There are two broad problems with the current media environment. The first of these is conflicts of interest. And there are several types of conflicts of interest. So first we can talk about conflicts of interest in terms of the ownership of media corporations. This is when a media company is owned by, for example, a holding company that owns other companies, or when a media company is owned by other business interests, or someone who has many diverse business interests but they also own media companies. This kind of conflicts of interest, when there is cross-ownership, prevents media companies from being genuinely free and independent. When a parent company owns a media corporation, it is unlikely to allow its various media channels to investigate, especially if they're going to be critical, the other business interests of that holding company or that parent company. So for example, if one holding company owns both a media corporation as well as a company that produces vehicles or cars, then there is an incentive to have that holding company, that parent company, prevent the media corporation or its media division, branch, whatever you want to call it, from investigating the safety of the vehicles that are produced by the other branch of this mega corporation. If you can imagine a company that owns both a news broadcast channel and a car manufacturing business, it's not going to let the car manufacturing business be criticized by the media channel because this goes against the interests of the parent company. So that's a conflict of interest in ownership. Another example is that if a parent company owns both a weapons manufacturing business and a media corporation with media channels, then this provides a very strong incentive for that parent company to, for example, encourage wars so that its other branch can sell more weapons. So this cross-ownership, when it involves a media corporation, is quite dangerous, and it really is a big conflict of interest. So that's the first conflict of interest. Expanding upon this conflict of interest, it can even exist if the parent company only owns a portion of a different business. Even if it's not a controlling share, this cross-ownership has negative consequences. For example, any negative coverage of the other interests of the owners will reduce the value of their investment. To give you an example, if a parent company owns shares in, let's say, a chemical manufacturing firm, and then also owns shares in a media company, this would discourage the media corporation from reporting that any chemicals that are produced by that firm cause cancer, if that's the case. So external ownership like this creates a disincentive for media corporations to run stories that damage the general interests of their owners. Even if they don't have a controlling share, they can still, for example, threaten to sell off all their shares and lower the stock price of the media corporation. And just that threat is enough to have some control. Or they might have enough control to band together with other owners to voice their concerns and have control of the media company. So whenever you get an ownership stake in a media corporation by outside investors who have interests in other industries, this also opens the doors to other kinds of conflicts of interest. For example, if a parent company has interests in the fossil fuel industry, they will encourage their media divisions to disregard the effects of burning fossil fuels. One of the biggest consequences of this kind of conflict of interest in media ownership is that it undermines the quality of democracy. This is because external media ownership erodes the quality and the integrity of any kind of reporting, and it limits the ability of the public to make informed decisions. It undermines the provision of free and unbiased information. This then limits the ability of the public to make informed decisions. There is an incentive to censure any investigative reports or criticism of any of the other businesses that might be owned by the parent companies or parent corporations. Media corporations that are owned by the same parent company are less likely to use those media channels that they own to investigate any of the other companies that are in the group or owned by the same parent companies or are in the same conglomerate or owned by the same family of companies. This limits what those media channels can report on. So this creates biased coverage that then distorts public priorities and impacts the candidates and parties that voters will support. It will influence the kinds of legislation that get proposed. It will change the priorities of the legislature. It will change policy priorities and policies of governments It determines the kinds of regulations that get focused on and enforced. Media corporations that have been compromised by this kind of cross-ownership are not able to perform their function of informing the public in an unbiased and independent way. They're not able to investigate all issues that might arise because of the conflicting interests caused by the cross-ownership. This means they won't provide accurate information about critical issues that voters might want to know about. People are going to be unable to make properly informed decisions, and public debate will suffer as a result. So democracy and collective public decision-making is reduced and harmed by having cross-ownership of media corporations. Conflicts of interest in media ownership negatively affect everyone in society, including the individuals who might actually own the media company. The reason for this is that even people who own media companies have to eat food that might carry a greater risk of causing cancer or health consequences, because this food might be subject to less scrutiny. Owners of media companies will be using products that are subject to less investigative journalism and fewer safety studies or fewer stories that investigate the safety of those products. The owners of media companies are going to be at risk of more frequent extreme weather events because media coverage has delayed action on climate change for decades. So there are health consequences, there are financial consequences, and there are safety consequences even for the owners of media, because every owner of media that has cross-ownership conflicts of interest is going to be doing this. So a compromised media environment means that the media is not doing its job, and every aspect of society becomes less scrutinized, which means they might be less safe, more corrupt. The owners of media companies will breathe air that could be cleaner if polluting industries were investigated more often. They will travel in vehicles that are more dangerous because the safety issues that should have been investigated by a more independent media were not publicized or investigated. So even if the owners of media companies somehow manage to escape these consequences, their children, parents, friends, relatives, and colleagues may not be as lucky. Conflicts of interest from external media ownership have negative consequences for everyone's health, safety, their opportunities, and their well-being. There's another kind of conflict of interest that has to do with advertising revenue. When a for-profit media company relies on advertising revenue, this creates a reason to avoid criticizing the companies that are providing this advertising revenue. This incentive exists even if a media corporation is not part of the same group of companies. Even if the advertisers are not part of the same multinational conglomerate or corporation, it still creates a disincentive for media companies to not criticize those companies. It becomes a matter of financial survival for profit-seeking media corporations to avoid criticizing their advertisers. This is especially true when the advertisers are large multinational corporations that control many brands. They could withdraw all of their ad spending for all of their other brands, even if only one of their brands gets investigated or receives negative coverage. Media channels will therefore avoid running negative stories about any of these brands to avoid upsetting the large company that has many brands. They will avoid negative coverage of advertisers' products, services, practices, industries, or owners, all to prevent losing advertising revenue. The profit motive therefore corrupts the integrity of the content of those media channels. It provides an incentive to avoid reporting on topics that might upset advertisers. The risk of losing out on advertising revenue also influences the kinds of topics that are covered by media corporations. This is true even when the content is not about a particular brand. For example, large candy or soda manufacturing companies controlling sugary brands would not want their products advertised alongside content about the dangers of consuming too much sugar. Similarly, breweries or distilleries that are selling alcohol will not want to advertise their products if media content is warning about the health consequences of consuming alcohol. Another example would be pharmaceutical companies will not want to advertise their products alongside any content that exposes the manipulated science that supports their drug approvals. Companies that sell processed meats will not want to advertise alongside stories exposing the unethical and environmental problems of factory farming animals. Any hotel or restaurant groups will not want to advertise their brands alongside stories that expose low pay and poor working conditions in the hospitality industry. Media corporations will therefore censure the kinds of topics and stories that they air to avoid losing out on any advertising revenue. So the information we will get from private media that depends on advertising revenue is censored to avoid risking profits and avoid upsetting potential advertisers. Another conflict of interest arises when media corporations are owned or controlled by ideologically motivated individuals or groups. This type of ownership creates a systematic bias in the media channel content. It favors special interests or censures content that does not match the morals, beliefs, or values or ideological positions of the special interest owners. Often wealthy individuals will own media corporations and use them to impose their political viewpoints on public debates, or they might use their media channels to advantage a favored political party or candidate. Wealthy individuals might also use their media channels to prop up and support their other business interests, or simply to protect their other assets. We might also have a situation where religious figures or institutions, ethnic or cultural organizations, or even politicians and political parties own media corporations, and they are going to then use their channels to protect their own interests. They will use those channels to promote their religious or cultural viewpoints, or they will criticize their political opponents. These kinds of ideological media channels often will marginalize or demonize opposing beliefs or groups. Media that's owned by ideologically motivated interests is often no better than propaganda. It conflicts with the function of media to deliver unbiased information, and it prevents citizens from getting a balanced perspective to enable them to make an informed decision. The second kind of problem with the current media environment is that the ownership of media has become extremely concentrated. This is a problem for democracy because it gives unelected private interests an enormous amount of power and influence over our societies. It creates a less pluralistic media environment where there are fewer voices, where certain perspectives get marginalized or not heard at all, and public debate is severely limited. This undermines the quality of any public decision-making because not enough viewpoints and perspectives are being heard. It limits policy options because certain options are taken off the table by not even being heard or by being unduly criticized by vested interests controlling the media. So it shapes the kinds of legislation that become possible in a society and the kinds of bills that are proposed in a legislature. It also limits the kinds of people that can run for office and get realistic chances at being elected. These are very serious problems for a society and for a democracy. We don't hear about them enough because the media corporations that should be informing us about these problems are part of the problem. The concentration of media ownership undermines the ability of media corporations to provide unbiased information to the public. So where we used to have concentrated government media ownership, this problem has evolved into one where we have concentrated private media ownership. So we are not being oppressed by our governments through the media, but topics are being censored in the media that go against corporate interests. We focus so much on ensuring that the media was free from government control, which was good to achieve, that it became controlled by private interests. But this is not what a free media should mean. Private control is possibly even worse than government control because corporations are not directly accountable to citizens in the same way that governments are. For example, we cannot vote out corporations, we cannot remove them from power, and we cannot overthrow them in the same way that we can overthrow governments or get governments out of power at an election. Media concentration undermines the flow of information that is very necessary for an informed public to have a good debate and to ensure a healthy democratic process. Concentrated media ownership reduces the quality and the diversity of news channels. It reduces the number of voices that we hear. It limits the kinds of perspectives that we're exposed to, and certain stories don't get told. It gives an enormous amount of power to special private interests. A highly concentrated media system also makes it difficult for new channels to enter the market, as existing players can now use their economic power to block the entry of new media channels that might offer those alternative voices and perspectives. The concentration of media ownership reduces the integrity of the media overall, and as a result, society and democracy suffer. The problem of concentrated media ownership also connects to the problem of conflicts of interest within media ownership. For example, any news coverage of a media corporation merging with another media corporation is not objective if it's being covered in the news story by one of the companies involved in the merger. We're not going to see fair coverage because there's conflicts of interest between the interests of the purchasing corporation, and even the one that's being purchased might not want to spoil the deal because the owners of that smaller media company might stand to gain a great deal. So media coverage of the consolidation of the media isn't covered by the media. The coverage will tend to favor the interests of any of the parent companies or any of the investors that want the deal to go ahead to establish a greater concentration in the ownership, which will allow them to charge higher prices to advertisers and achieve greater power over society. This all happens at the expense of the public. The public interest is in maintaining economic diversity and a dynamic competition. But when media concentration gets too high, this is undermined. The very media that is supposed to warn us of the dangers of media consolidation will instead promote that consolidation and downplay any risks that might arise from it. So this is why we cannot rely on self-regulation in industries that are as important to society as the media. So now we have to look at solutions. We've outlined the problems, which is various types of conflicts of interest and a highly concentrated media ownership. But what can we do about that?